The campfire crackled with an impossible blue light, casting strange shadows through the ancient forest of New Georgia. 5 Texas knights sat around it, their power armor decorated with a mix of traditional longhorns and what appeared to be carefully calculated tax deductions rendered in gold filigree. Ted, tax evader Schiff, adjusted his armor's built-in cowboy hat, a modification that had technically been declared illegal by 3 different government agencies. He'd filed the paperwork to contest those declarations on carbonized paper through the quantum mail to an office that may or may not have existed in a superposition of bureaucratic states. Sir, the newest addition to their squad, Dallas Franklin, fresh from the academy, but already sporting a "don't tread on me" snake coiled around her quantum spurs, broke the comfortable silence. "I've been meaning to ask about your motto." "Which one?" Ted drawled, his helmet's voice modulation making his Texas accent even more pronounced. "I've got more mottos than the IRS has forms and twice as many loopholes in 'em." The other knights chuckled. They'd heard this routine before, but like any good Texas tradition, it got better with repetition. The one about death in Texas, Dallas clarified, her own armor bearing the fresh marks of their last skirmish with the stone-skinned beings, perfectly angled marks that could, theoretically, be written off as business expenses. Ted leaned forward, the campfire reflecting off his visor in a way that definitely violated several laws of physics and at least one tax code. "2 things are certain, death in Texas," he recited, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd found every possible exception to both rules. "Been saying that since our first encounter with the distortion, back when they thought they could impose their idea of order on our little corner of the galaxy. Thought it was death and taxes," rumbled Diego, their heavy weapons specialist whose armor bore the inscription "Taxation is theft" in Spanish, English, and 3 alien languages. "That's what they want you to think," Ted replied, pointing a gauntleted finger skyward. "See, death's always been a sure thing. Can't argue with that. But taxes," he laughed, the sound making his armor's quantum field ripple. "Taxes are just what happens when someone ain't creative enough to find another solution. Texas, though, Texas is as inevitable as the heat death of the universe and a hell of a lot more fun to witness." He reached into a compartment in his armor and pulled out what looked like a flask but was actually a highly sophisticated quantum containment unit that just happened to be flask-shaped. The fact that it hadn't been properly registered with the Colonial Revenue Service was, he maintained, purely coincidental. "When we first formed the Knights," he continued, passing the flask around, "Earth's government tried to regulate us. Wanted licenses for our quantum spurs, permits for our energy swords, tax stamps for our power armor." He shook his head, the movement causing his armor's hat to tip slightly. "Told him the same thing we told the distortion: you can't regulate what you can't comprehend, and you sure as hell can't tax what you can't catch." Dallas took a sip from the flask, her armor's environmental systems registering the contents as technically not bootlegged quantum moonshine for plausible deniability. "Is that why High Command stopped trying to file standard battle reports for our engagements?" "Partly," Ted nodded. "But mostly it's cause we kept submitting them in interpretive dance format. Turns out bureaucrats get mighty frustrated when you express casualty figures through the medium of the Cotton Eye Joe." The campfire popped, sending sparks spiraling up into the alien night. Somewhere in the distance, their scanners picked up movement from the stone-skinned beings that a lot of folks had taken to calling rockers. Ted and the others weren't in any hurry to fight rocks, though. The enemy had learned the hard way that rushing a Texas night was about as effective as trying to collect back taxes from a quantum anomaly. "See, that's the thing about being a Texas night," Ted continued, settling back against a log that had been carved with the entire text of the Texas Constitution, including annotations on tax law. "We're not just fighting for victory. We're fighting for something bigger. The right to be free, to be Texan, and to submit our battle plans in whatever damn format we please." The others nodded sagely. Even the campfire seemed to burn a little brighter, though Ted would later claim that was just because it was exercising its right to peaceful assembly with nearby particles. Above them, the stars twinkled in patterns that suspiciously resembled various tax exemption codes. Ted smiled behind his visor. Some might call it paranoia, this constant awareness of government oversight. He called it vigilance, and an excellent excuse to modify his armor's sensor array in ways that would give an accountant nightmares. "Get some rest. Why all?" he advised as the second moon rose, its light catching the "Don't Audit Main" sticker he'd somehow managed to apply to his quantum sword. "Tomorrow we're going to teach those rockers about the real meaning of freedom. And if that lesson happened to involve some creative interpretations of both physics and fiscal policy, well, that was just the Texas way. Y'all ever notice, Ted mused, poking at the campfire with his energy sword in clear violation of at least 3 safety regulations, how these rocker folk operate exactly like the Internal Revenue Service. Dallas looked up from where she was maintaining her quantum spurs, carefully documenting each adjustment as a business expense. How do you figure that, sir? Well, Ted shifted, his armor's decorative rattlesnake decals catching the firelight. They show up uninvited, demand payment for existing, and throw a fit when you explain that your consciousness is technically registered as a sovereign entity in international space. He grinned behind his visor. Had that argument with both of them actually. Diego chuckled, the sound rumbling through his heavy armor. That why you modified your spurs to disrupt their molecular structure, tax protest. Now that there's an interesting story. Ted leaned forward, his armor's hat tilting at what he called a fiscally responsible angle. See, a couple months back, we were dealing with a rocker patrol near New Rio. They come at us with their standard line about protection fees and mandatory contributions to planetary security. He paused, reaching down to adjust one of his quantum spurs, the left one, which had taxation etched on it in letters that somehow managed to look both defiant and properly depreciated for tax purposes. So I tells them, boys, I've got some bad news and some worse news. Bad news is, we don't take kindly to unauthorized collections in Texas space. Worse news is, I've got 37 different forms proving these spurs are registered as religious expressions of fiscal independence. The campfire crackled appreciatively, its flames forming patterns that looked suspiciously like various tax exemption clauses. Of course, they didn't take that well. Started charging up their energy matrices, spouting something about compliance protocols and mandatory enforcement procedures. That's when I activated these beauties. He tapped his spurs, which hummed with barely contained quantum energy. Turns out you hit their rocky structure with just the right frequency. It starts vibrating at the same resonance as a tax code audit. Dallas's visor tilted in confusion. How is that even possible? Question ain't how it's possible, Ted corrected, wagging a gauntleted finger. Question is how it's going to get filed on the after-action report. I've got it listed under Educational Outreach and Cultural Exchange Program. A soft chime interrupted their conversation, a priority message from high command scrolling across their helmet displays. Ted took his time reading it, deliberately counting to 30 while humming deep in the heart of Texas. Sir, Dallas prompted. Shouldn't we respond immediately? Now that's exactly what they expect, Ted drawled, finally reaching for his comm unit. Ain't no government got the right to rush a free Texan. Besides, he added with a chuckle, I'm exercising my right to a reasonable response time. It's in the Constitution. Probably. Somewhere between the Second Amendment and the part about not quartering soldiers without proper barbecue facilities. He stood up, his armor whirring with carefully maintained servos that he'd insisted on calibrating himself because couldn't trust the government contractors not to install tracking software. The movement caused his quantum sword to catch the firelight, revealing the elaborate scrollwork along its blade that, viewed from the right angle, spelled out. We've got the right to life, liberty, and the evasion of taxes. Speaking of rights, he continued, drawing the sword in a flourish that somehow incorporated 3 different tax law precedents into its arc. Let me show why all a new technique I've been working on. Been calling it the 10th Amendment Special. The other knights gathered around as Ted demonstrated, his sword leaving trails of blue fire that curved and twisted in patterns that seemed to briefly create their own sovereign tax jurisdiction in the surrounding space-time. See, the trick as Ted began, but a sudden alert from their perimeter sensors cut him short. The stone-skinned beings were on the move, and earlier than expected. Well now, Ted said, his voice carrying that special tone of someone who'd just found another loophole in both physics and tax law. Looks like we're about to hold ourselves a practical demonstration instead. He raised his sword, the quantum blade humming with energy that the Colonial Revenue Service had specifically classified as too independent for comfortable taxation. Remember, folks, he announced as they formed up, when they demand their protection fees, hit him with Form 1099 MISC. Gets him every time. The night air crackled with tension and questionable tax deductions as the Texas Knights prepared to teach some living rocks about the true meaning of fiscal freedom Texas style. The rockers emerged from the forest like walking tax audits, rigid, geometric, and absolutely certain of their authority. Their stone-clad bodies pulsed with internal light that somehow managed to look both bureaucratic and threatening. "Attention human entities," their leader broadcast on all frequencies. "You are currently occupying space under our protection. Standard rates apply, with compounding interest for armed presence. Payment is due immediately." Ted Tax Evader Schiff stood up slowly, his power armor systems humming what sounded suspiciously like the first bars of the Eyes of Texas. The campfire behind him cast his shadow across the clearing, a shadow that, due to some creative modifications to his armor's quantum field, was technically registered as a sovereign entity in 3 different star systems. "Now folks," he drawled, his voice carrying that special tone reserved for dealing with bureaucrats and hostile aliens, "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding about your jurisdiction here." His fellow knights spread out in a formation that looked random but was actually based on the most efficient tax-dodging strategies of the last 3 centuries. Dallas took up position on his left, her quantum spurs leaving trails that formed perfect copies of the 16th Amendment with annotations. The rocker leader stepped forward, its faceted surface refracting light in patterns that looked disturbingly like tax assessment forms. "Our jurisdiction is absolute. Resistance will result in additional fees. You know what your problem is?" Ted asked, casually activating his sword's quantum field modulation, the one he'd specifically modified to create what he called a tax-free zone in the fabric of space-time. "I all are operating under the assumption that your rules apply to Texas." He raised his sword, the blade glowing with energy that had been carefully calibrated to disrupt both stony structures and bureaucratic procedures. "Let me introduce you to a little thing we call the Liberty Doctrine. What happened next would later be described in official reports as Fiscal Force Majeure and Quantum Tax Rebellion." Ted led his knights in a maneuver that somehow combined advanced theoretical physics with 300 years of tax protest history. Their quantum spurs left trails of blue fire that created a complex network of energy patterns that, when viewed from orbit, looked exactly like the most comprehensive tax exemption form ever filed. The stone-skinned beings found their perfectly ordered molecular structures beginning to resonate with frequencies that matched the vibration of a full IRS audit. "Diego," Ted called out, "hit him with the 1040s. Special." Dallas, catching on quick, executed a perfect flanking maneuver while broadcasting the entire text of Atlas Shrugged on the quantum frequency. The rocker leader, its perfect geometric form starting to show signs of stress, attempted to rally its forces. This is unauthorized. You must submit to proper procedures. Now that there's where you're wrong," Ted replied, his sword describing arcs that were technically classified as performance art for tax purposes. "We don't have to submit to anything. See, while y'all were busy trying to collect your fees, I took the liberty of auditing your entire civilization's financial structure." He gestured to his armor's display, which was somehow running both combat analytics and tax preparation software simultaneously. "By my calculations, factoring in depreciation, charitable contributions to the cause of liberty, and the standard deductions for quantum combat operations in a free market zone," he paused for dramatic effect, "I all owe us back taxes." The rockers vibrated in horror, as Ted's calculations, carried out with the same creative interpretation of mathematics that he applied to his annual tax returns, cascaded through their collective consciousness. Their perfectly ordered ranks began to dissolve into chaos. "This is impossible," their leader protested, its form flickering between states of fiscal panic. "Impossible," Ted laughed, the sound carrying both victory and several questionable deductions. "Son, that's just the Texas way. We've got a saying back home, 2 things are certain, death and Texas. And today, why all are getting a full audit of both." The battle ended not with a bang, but with the sound of 1,000 stone-skinned beings simultaneously filing for bankruptcy. As the survivors retreated into the forest, their once perfect forms now riddled with quantum deductions, Ted turned back to his fellow knights. "And that, folks," he announced, powering down his sword and adjusting his armor's hat to a rakish angle, "is how you handle unauthorized collection attempts." They gathered once more around the campfire, which was now burning in patterns that perfectly illustrated the principle of trickle-down economics. Dallas, still processing what she'd witnessed, finally spoke up. "Sir, did you really audit their entire civilization during combat?" Ted's visor gleamed with the light of both victory and creative accounting. "Let's just say I've added a new line to our motto. In this galaxy, you can count on death, you can count on Texas, but you sure as hell can't count on us paying taxes." The campfire crackled in agreement, its flames forming what looked suspiciously like a perfectly filed tax exemption form. Above them, the stars of New Georgia twinkled in patterns that, if properly documented, could probably be claimed as dependents. Just another night for the Texas Knights, keeping the galaxy safe for liberty, justice, and creative interpretation of both physics and tax code, one impossible victory at a time. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave it a like and to subscribe if you'd like to see more. Feel free to comment and share it as well. With all that said, go on and check out the video in the top left. I think you might like it.